So this has been a really busy weekend, theologically speaking. So last night I was at a Jewish Seder celebration, which many of you are probably familiar that the Seder is a celebration of the Jewish Passover. It commemorates the story of deliverance by a God that comes through for a bunch of folks that were in right relationship with Him. And then, of course, today is Easter. It's the culmination of the Christian Holy Week, basically the climax of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And it's an extension of the Jewish deliverance story of the festival that I was at last night. It's a symbolic story of deliverance of a fallen people through the death and resurrection of a human being who personified, frankly, perfect love. Well, then there's also Ostera, which has German pagan roots, Germanic pagan roots, of the Christian celebration of Easter. It's a story of gods in dispute with each other, as they always are, and an honoring of the return of spring. And I always think fondly of that because my uber-Christian mother was equally obsessed with everything to do with this holiday as well. We had, not only on my wall, we had this like tomb of Jesus with a moving rock that I can move back and forth and see Jesus appear. But we had bunnies, we had elaborately decorated eggs hanging from pussy willow branches, tulips, lilies, chicks, the whole 9 yards. And then I would say, theologically speaking, one more holiday this weekend would be Earth Day, the founding of the modern environmental movement to try to save the earth from the degradation that primarily humans have done. And if you think about it, at least in my mind, it's a very public acknowledgement of the interconnectedness of the web of nature, but it's perhaps a less public acknowledgement of our common evolution. And if you think about it from evolutionary terms, it immediately brings up this conflict in our culture, God versus evolution, or as I titled my sermon today, God and evolution. Which then immediately popped in a story from high school. Many of you know I went to a Christian fundamentalist high school, willingly, loved it. It was a very small school, so the staff had to double up. And so my religion teacher was also my biology teacher. You kind of know where that's going. So in biology class one day, we were talking about, of course, creationism. And this is probably the moment in my life, I was probably 15, where I was probably the seedling of a budding, questioning you was there. I bravely raised my hand and said, well, if that's true, that the world's only a few thousand years old, then how do you explain all these dinosaur bones that are buried all over the world, right? And he didn't miss a beat and said, well, Jim, Satan planted those dinosaur bones so that we would doubt the existence of God. And I kind of put my hand down and went, I'll have to think about that one. Because basically he set it up that if I didn't believe in evolution, then I didn't believe in God. Which then leads me to today's topic. I wanted to introduce Reverend Michael Dowd and his book, Thank God for Evolution, How the Marriage of Science and Religion Will Transform Your Life and Your World. Now, the inside cover gives this glowing review of who Reverend Michael Dowd is. Apparently, he's America's evolutionary evangelist. I love that title. I wonder if that's on his cards. He's dedicated his life to proclaiming the great news of the sacred view of cosmic, biological, and human evolution. Now, in the 1980s and 90s, he was a United Church of Christ minister and pastored 3 congregations, as well as a leader in environmental peace and justice issues across the country. But in 2002, he and his wife, Connie Barlow, sold everything they had and bought a camper. And they've been on the road since then, giving presentations across North America, essentially, to numerous churches and secular organizations. I should mention that Connie, his wife, is an acclaimed science writer as well. So he's very popular, and about a year and a half ago, I think it was, he was at the Fox Valley Unitarian Universalist Church up in Appleton, and there was a whole bunch of you there. I sat in the row behind you, and you took up an entire row. How many of you were there that night? Okay, very good. Well, that was I'd never heard of Michael Dowd before, and that was my first introduction to their theology, and I was just fascinated. But I don't know if the rest of you felt like I did. He was talking at lightning speed that night, and the amount of concepts that he was downloading were so fast, I think a computer would only be the thing that could keep up, unless you've already read his stuff. But I was fascinated, and I bought his book that night. It's an autographed copy. And I said that I'm going to do a sermon on it. And I think I promised this maybe a year ago, and it was a tough time. And I realized when I started reading it that this book is super dense, just like his talk was that night. And I had to postpone because there was something else. So I'm back today to talk about it. And even now, I'm only doing one chapter. Chapter 7, what do we mean by the word God? So I'm back to the question, do you believe in God? Well, then the question inevitably leads to, well, who's God? What God? And Dowd steps back from that. Instead of going there first, why don't we rephrase the question and start with something that we all know something about? That would be life. So he says, can you ask a question, do you believe in life? He goes, okay, that's a rhetorical question. That's absurd. You don't need to believe in life. Life is. It's all around. You're all sitting there looking at me. You're all alive, I think. And I'm alive, I think. Okay, that's a philosophical realm I'm not going to go into. But you can empirically measure life on this planet and in the galaxy. So it's nothing that doesn't need to be believed in. It just is. But then, of course, what we say about life is open to interpretation. We talk about life using metaphor to help us describe its meaning, its nature, its purpose. Phrases like, life is wonderful. Or if you're not so fortunate, you might say life is brutal. Or some folks would say life is unimportant. What happens after death is really all that matters. And therein lies kind of the confusion about who's telling this great story and what position they're coming from it. And so that's where Reverend Dowd comes in, and he says, essentially there has to be a holy narrative that helps answer these big questions. Who am I? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Why does it even matter? And he said these great stories often start with a common creation story. And so in this context today, I'm including evolution and Earth Day story as the creation story. But I guess what does this have to do with believing God? Well, for Reverend Dowd, he would say a science-based creation story is completely congruous with belief in God. And here's why. He has this passionate understanding of God, and he says it this way: any understanding of God that does not take in, quote, the wholeness of reality, and then in parentheses, measurable and unmeasurable, is inadequate. Any understanding of God that does not take in the wholeness of reality is inadequate. Now, a digression quickly. Our theme this month, as Tracy said, is wholeness. And if you remember when I was here 2 weeks ago, I was talking more about personal wholeness. The title was From Ouch to Ah. So it was, how do you get through all those painful experiences that tell you you're inadequate to get a more holistic, whole living, wholehearted life? Well, I was intrigued when I was preparing for this sermon a couple months ago on some of the quotes from Dowd, because he talks about this wholeness of reality. So I went from the personal individual to the wholeness of galaxies here today. And the source of Dowd's passion and drive, I think, can be summarized into this quote. He says, "The emergence of the great story, a sacred narrative that embraces yet transcends all scientific, religious, and cultural stories, will come to be cherished, I believe, first and foremost, for enriching the depth and breadth of our experience of God." So what he's saying is, there's this human nature to kind of want something that's higher than us. He calls it God. And he said that if we have a sacred narrative that can combine the scientific, the religious, the cultural, that can kind of combine it and yet transcend it, he said, then that will be the enriching story, because it's enriching our experience about God. Okay, like I said, there's a lot here, so bear with me. I love this phrase. He says, this sacred narrative is divinely creative in a nested, emergent sense. You got that? I love his language. I'm like, what? This sacred narrative is divinely creative in a nested, emergent sense. And thank God he gave me examples to explain it to you. He starts with subatomic particles. Subatomic particles are entities unto themselves and then make up atoms, correct? And then you have atoms that join together to make molecules. And molecules join together and make cells. And cells join together and make organisms. And at least in human terms, there are others, but human is the dominant, organisms join together to create societies, which then populate the planet. And there are many planets that organize together to make star systems. And star systems are in galaxies like the Milky Way, and ultimately you get to these super clusters of galaxies that are all floating around the universe. So his idea of this, if you think of it like nesting dolls, those Russian nesting dolls, that they increase in size and complexity as you get bigger and bigger. So he would say that each part of this nesting doll thinking is both part of a unique part of something else, as well as the sum of things greater than its parts. So think about hydrogen and oxygen. By themselves, they're two gases, they're atoms, they're on the periodic table, they exist everywhere, but they come together and they create water. Water, some of you are scientists and you're going to refute this, but water is nothing like hydrogen or oxygen to me. Water is water, and it's pervasive throughout the whole planet. And so that's the kind of idea that you still have hydrogen and oxygen existing unto themselves, but now they are part of something greater than the parts, and it goes on and on and on. So the concept, simply put, is at any given point of creation, everything, including you and I, are both the sum of our parts and then part of something greater. So he says that if reality is understood as nestedly creative, it doesn't have to be a belief. Because I just did it sort of scientifically. I'm not a scientist, but basically I give you examples that is life. It exists, but he calls it nestedly creative. And so it's not a belief, it's simply an empirical fact that exists. So therefore, he would say that God is a metaphorical name used for the largest nesting doll, the one and only creative reality, the whole shebang. God is the source of everything, God is infused in everything, and God is co-emergent and indistinguishable from anything. And that night, when he was talking and giving all these examples, I remember him saying, it can be the supreme wholeness or the supreme reality or God. And he kept substituting. Reality, God, doesn't really matter, but this is how he interchanges it. And his quote here is that God is understood foundationally as a holy, proper name for, quote, the wholeness of reality, measurable and non-measurable. And with this definition of God, there's no conflict with mainstream biology, cultural, planetary, or cosmic evolution. God is perceived as the immanent creativity present in all of it. All right. So using this context for the wholeness of reality, it's pointless to talk about whether God, evolution, or, quote, the self-organizing dynamics of emergent complexity created the universe. He says, and I love this quote, it's like debating whether it was me, my fingers tapping the keyboard, or the electrical synapses of my nervous system that produced this sentence. It doesn't really matter. It's all God in his point of view. Dowd would say that we are all part of the wholeness of reality, and therefore God. Which then leads me to the handout I hope you were given when you walked in the door. So you're going to be all theology geeks today. So I want to walk through it. I doubt that you studied it thoroughly when you walked in the door, because this is a friendly bunch and you probably were reading each other. So let me kind of walk through it a little bit. The first one at the top is theism. So this is the dominant in Judeo-Christian theology. It's a belief in an interventionist God. So theists tend to imagine that the world was set up, the universe was set up in a machine-like thing, obeying all these laws, and by this supreme being that resides off the planet and outside of the universe, but if the right people with the right motives beseech him or her or it, God will intervene in history. So that's your classic theist theology that we live in and dominates our culture here. Deism is similar but different. Still believing in this machine-like creation, but the concept here is that some supreme, super-duper engineer created it in the dawning of time and then stepped back and has nothing to do with it from now on. Just, this is my snow globe scenario, that we're all part of God's snow globe. So he's sitting in a library somewhere in a stuffed chair, and the snow globe's on the shelf, and he might wander over and shake it up once in a while. But anyway, that's just me and my creative mind. This is, Thomas Jefferson was in this space. Kind of a rationalist who disregarded all the miracles and supernatural in the Bible, but yet he believed in a God. So that's the deists. Then the atheism. A concept popularized in the 17th century, meaning disbelief in any sort of God or supreme being, interventionist or not. Atheist traditional also imagine nature as a machine-like thing that has to follow certain laws without any kind of supernatural lawmaker or lawgiver. So this is pure science at its pure core form, and actually informs a lot of the humanist traditions that we've had through most of the 20th century. Not always, but mostly. Then you have pantheism. Pantheism is as old as human consciousness. So this is the belief that God and spirituality is in everything. Rocks, trees, buildings, as well as people. And that it makes itself manifest as distinct forces and often in very specific locales. The pantheists typically equate God with the universe and with nothing transcending nature. So this is where kind of the pagan tradition Ostera comes from, that everything's alive with spirituality, the divine is in all things. So a lot of paganism would be lumped into this bucket. Then there's panentheism, and I struggle sometimes to say it. I don't know if it's panentheism or panentheism. I've heard both. So this is a concept in the early 20th century with process philosophy, and it's meaning that God is in creation and creation is in God. So they see nature as a revelation or embodied expression of divinity. It's process theology kind of stuff. When I was researching this, the best example that I could come up with was a lot of Hinduism is this way. The God is in everything and everything's in God. And so it's that concept of the nested dolls, but as Reverend Dowd would say, right idea, but it never really caught on in the 20th century. And he didn't say this outright, but I think he's implying because it didn't really embrace the logic and science side of things that were coming to their heyday in the 20th century. So finally, we have what he and Connie came up with. Now, I love this. Hang on. You can say it two different ways. You know, we're very open to everything. So see if you get the difference. Creatheism or creatheism. Get that? Creatheism or creatheism. So he explains it this way. Connie is an atheist at heart, and so she likes to use the term creatheism. That's also what I will use. Reverend Dowd is a theist at heart, so he likes creatheism. So the two can go together and coexist. So obviously it's a concept started in the 21st century by them. It's grounded in an empirical, or I would say scientific, understanding of the nested emergent nature of divine creativity. I'm going to read right what it says. For creatheists, God is a holy name for the ultimate reality, the all-encompassing wholeness, that which includes yet transcends all realities. Creatheism regards nature as a revelation or expression of the divine, particularly in its emergent creativity. And then this next paragraph, I think, is really interesting, but it's a mouthful. Creatheism understands humanity as a self-reflective aspect of creation that allows the wholeness of reality, seen and unseen, manifest and unmanifest, i.e. God, to be honored in conscious awareness and to guide our own deliberate manifestations of that divine creativity. This guy has a vocabulary that's unbelievable. I will go into that in a minute, but I just loved that paragraph. And then I love his sense of humor. He has one more type, apatheism. So, This gets, and eventually I'll go back to the second half of that that creationism paragraph. The role of humanity in an evolving universe. Dowd closes out this chapter with a call to action. If we believe that last part of creatism, and I'll read it again, creatism understands humanity as a self-reflective aspect of creation that allows the wholeness of reality to be honored in conscious awareness and to guide our deliberate manifestations of that divine creativity. If we believe that, it means that as the only self-reflective part of creation that we know of, our meaning and purpose is how we contribute to the well-being of any of the other greater dimensions of existence. That's a quote from Dowd again. So how does our species contribute to the larger body of life? Now, and even seeded then into the future, our purpose on earth, if this is our theology, is to contribute to the wholeness of reality, to contribute to the wholeness of God. So I'll go back to our reading. It was another reading from Reverend Dowd. It said, "We do not do this through idolatry of self-centeredness," these are actually my words, "but rather, as the last paragraph stated, sanity, health, and ecological sustainability," and then he puts in parentheses, salvation, because he's an environmentalist. Salvation comes from ecological sustainability. All lie in the direction of faithfulness to God, understood not as a supreme being outside of the universe, because he's saying if we believe in a God that's outside of the universe, then and we are created in God's likeness, then we therefore are also out of God's universe, and so then we don't really care about it. So he's saying it relies in the direction of a faithfulness to God, understood not as a supreme being outside of the universe, but as a holy name for the whole of reality. Using traditional Christian language, one might say salvation is to be found in Christ-like evolutionary integrity. Integrity is the key word there. Honoring the past, being faithful in the present, and taking responsibility for the future. I'm going to close, and maybe this will bring more clarity, with a quote by Elizabeth Johnson. She's a Roman Catholic sister of St. Joseph, a theologian, and a leader in Christian feminism. She says, "The world is almost mind-numbingly dynamic. Out of the Big Bang came the stars, out of the stardust came the earth, and out of the earth came single-celled creatures. Out of the evolutionary life and death of these creatures came human beings with consciousness and freedom that concentrates the self-transcendence of matter itself. Human beings," she says, "are the universe become conscious of itself. We are the cantors of the universe." So I only have this for a closing. May we be true to such an auspicious role as we honor the wholeness of reality through Earth Day, Ostera, Easter, Passover, and all the manifestations of divine creativity. Thanks be to the God of creatheism.